If Tuesday was the first stress test for U.S. elections this year, what happened in Dallas County should worry you. It may seem like a small hiccup in one singular county in the country. In fact, Texas itself has 250 counties. This did happen to be the biggest one. But it's a preview of the sort of voter suppression that we can likely expect in this year's primaries and midterms. Let me paint you a picture in case you weren't watching in real time. Here in Dallas County, this is interesting because we've got 0 votes in on the Democratic side because those polls are open. Republicans are releasing votes. Half the vote is in. Cornyn's got 52% there. Let's take a look at the Democratic side of things. As you can see, notably, Dallas County is empty. We're waiting for those votes to come in. That was at 7:04 p.m. Central Time, 8:04 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday night, 4 minutes after the polls were set to close in Texas. 0 votes on the Democratic side were in because on Tuesday in Texas, voters headed to the polls for several huge primary races. In Dallas County, many voters showed up to their polling centers, the same polling centers that they've been using for the past 10 years. But this time, many were turned away. That's because for the first time in nearly a decade, voters were required to cast their ballots at an assigned neighborhood precinct determined by their address, which I know that's probably what a lot of you have to do, but it was different in Texas. In Texas, you were able to use any voting center in the county. And that caused mass confusion. The Dallas News reports, quote, the switch prompted widespread confusion. Hundreds showed up to vote at their familiar location, only to be told they were in the wrong place. Some voters reported navigators and election clerks even sent them to wrong locations. Frustrated residents struggled to navigate shifting poll sites, downed websites, and long, winding election lines. Others gave up entirely. The change was put in place in December, by the way, by the Dallas County Republican Party. How does that affect Democrats? Well, the decision by the Republican Party to do that forced the Democrats to follow suit and make the same change. County officials say they did make an effort to notify voters of the change, but clearly many people didn't get the memo. On Tuesday night, once concerns of voter disenfranchisement were realized, Democrats filed an emergency petition to extend voting hours from 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. Central Time, a 2-hour extension to try to mitigate that confusion and allow people who are at the wrong place to get to the right place. A judge granted that extension. But Republican State Attorney General Ken Paxton, who also happens to be running for the U.S. Senate and advanced to a runoff with the incumbent Senator John Cornyn, then successfully asked the state's Republican-led Supreme Court to block that 2-hour extension. So the Supreme Court ruled that ballots cast by people who joined the voting line after 7 p.m. should be separated and to be considered provisional ballots while legal challenges continue. According to the Dallas County Elections Department, more than 2,300 provisional ballots were cast and will remain on hold as the legal challenges unfold. Now, these were not provisional ballots until that second ruling by the state Supreme Court. Let me read you that quote from the Dallas News again. Frustrated residents struggled to navigate shifting poll sites, downed websites, and long winding election lines. Others gave up entirely. Gave up entirely. That right here is what the next wave of voter suppression is going to look like. Voter discouragement. Create just enough friction, just enough hurdles to discourage people from casting their ballot or having to get home to cook dinner for your kids or relieve the babysitter. Make the process confusing and frustrating enough that voters eventually just give up and go home. The attack on our elections this year won't be all at once. It will be death by 1,000 cuts. And that's not to say that bigger, more sweeping acts of voter suppression are not taking place, because they are. The Brennan Center for Justice found that as of October 25th, 29 restrictive voting laws have been passed across 16 states, all 29 of which are set to be in effect for this year's midterm elections. The most common restrictions affect voter list maintenance, mail-in voting, and voter ID. And that's the least of it when you consider the efforts by President Trump himself and Republicans in Congress. There's the SAVE Act, which could disenfranchise 21 million voters in one fell swoop. Plus the Trump administration's unprecedented attempt to seize voter rolls from every state, which is a violation of state law in many states. And for anyone whose memory does not stretch back to the lying, the threats, the violence, and the shenanigans of Trump's 2020 loss when he and his allies and supporters showed just how far they're willing to go to steal an election, some of the major players in that attempted coup are now handing out advice to election officials for this election. According to ProPublica, several high-ranking federal officials attended a summit last week at which prominent figures who worked to overturn Donald Trump's loss in the 2020 election pressed the president to declare a national emergency to take over this year's midterms. That summit was convened in part by Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. It was attended by some people who were actually charged with crimes related to attempting to overturn Donald Trump's 2020 election loss. Brendan Fisher, a director at the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan pro-democracy organization, told ProPublica, quote, "The meeting shows that the same people who tried to overturn the 2020 election have only grown better organized and are now embedded in the machinery of government." Joining me now is the author of that piece, ProPublica investigative reporter Doug Bach-Clark. Also with me is Ari Berman, national voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones. He's the author of multiple books, including Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for having us.
Doug, let's start with part of your remarkable reporting on this summit of high-ranking Trump officials and election deniers. You spoke to an attorney who worked on a draft executive order that would ban mail-in voting, get rid of voting machines as part of a federal takeover of the election system. And he told you that the summit and the draft order were all part of the same effort. Tell us more about that.
Yes. So Peter Tickton, who is a lawyer, he's also one of Trump's friends, told me that this is all part of an effort to get Trump to declare a national emergency. And when I say national emergency, a lot of your viewers are probably like, what's a national emergency around elections? Well, This would be an attempt for Trump to take over elections, federalize them, and really assert powers that haven't been claimed in the past over them.
And just to underscore your point, Doug, there's no national emergency. If one wanted to be a little sarcastic, I would say the national emergency is that not enough people vote in this country, that a smaller percentage than are eligible to vote. There's no other emergency to fix.
There, a lot of these people are trying to claim that there is. They say, there's a lot of non-citizens voting, and the data just doesn't bear this out. And so what they're trying to get Trump to do is to, make claims based on bogus data to take over the elections.
Ari, help me understand Dallas County. A lot of Americans will say, well, why don't you just vote in the precinct that's near your house where you're supposed to? Because we don't all have the same options that Dallas County had. But it's an interesting concept, right? For years, you could go to a center in the same way that, like in New York, if I'm going to do advance voting, I can go to a center where lots and lots of precincts vote in the same place. Tell me about that system and why Republicans decided that was problematic.
Well, the problem in Dallas County, Ali, was that they had one set of rules for early voting, and they had another set of rules for Election Day, and they changed at the last minute. So it was very confusing to people. They didn't know where they were supposed to go vote. And that just indicates that these last-minute changes to election laws can disenfranchise a lot of people. For example, the Save America Act, which would require you to have citizenship to register to vote, photo ID to cast a ballot, hand over your voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security. That bill would go into effect immediately if it passed. So imagine the disenfranchisement that would occur if you had all of these new restrictions on voting go into effect at once in the middle of a midterm election. So it just goes to show you that when you change laws and when you make voting more difficult right before an election without giving people time to prepare, it can lead to the kind of mass disenfranchisement we saw in Dallas on Tuesday.
So, Doug, there's been reporting that some activists are pushing President Trump to declare a national emergency to the point that we were just discussing and federalize elections. I'm trying to get my head around the idea that your reporting indicates all these states that are putting in more restrictive voting. There's the concept of the SAVE Act, which will disenfranchise people. And then there's things like we saw in Dallas County, right? The death by 1,000 cuts things, the things that are not grandiose and discussed, but just add enough friction that it may discourage marginal voters.
Well, the important thing to understand here is that at this meeting, 30 of some of the sort of most high-profile election deniers in the country, they were discussing, what the right way to approach them, changing rules for the midterms was. There was a camp, according to sources who were there, who told me, there are some people who want to sort of take the legal route. They want to push the SAVE Act. They want to do death by 1,000 cuts, sort of introduce friction little by little. But one of those activists told me, the consensus here among these activists was we should actually tell the federal officials here to go tell Trump to do a national emergency, because these little bits of friction, they're not enough. Trying to get the SAVE Act passed, that's not enough. These little things are not enough. We really need to overturn the whole system and declare a national emergency.
So, Ari, reasonable people hearing Doug say that would say, that's ridiculous. We're not going to have Trump's not going to declare a national emergency over elections. But I wouldn't have told you 2 weeks ago we'd be in a war in Iran. And I wouldn't have told you 2 months ago that we'd have taken out the head of Venezuela. And I wouldn't have told you that we were bombing boats in the Caribbean. And there's a whole lot of things that have happened that I wouldn't have told you would have happened. So I don't know. How seriously do you take a bunch of election deniers who are suggesting that Donald Trump declare a national emergency and seize control of elections?
I think you have to take it very seriously because he listens to these election deniers. They're in high-ranking positions in the White House right now. They have his ear on the outside, and they want him to go as far as he can go. And the kind of crazy schemes that were talked down in 2020, declaring a national emergency to seize voting machines, what Sidney Powell and Mike Flynn and Patrick Byrne wanted Trump to do. There's no one in the room right now who would say, don't do that. In fact, it's the opposite. The people in the room are encouraging Trump to do these kind of crazy things. So it would be unconstitutional. It would be an unbelievable example of federal overreach. It would, quite frankly, be pure dictatorial type behavior. But that's exactly the kind of thing that Trump wants to do when it comes to elections. So I think we have to take it very seriously.
And Doug, there are a lot of serious people taking it very seriously. There are states' attorney generals who are pushing back against certain things. There are secretary of states who are getting together to try and figure things out. There are secretaries of state who are rejecting the Trump administration's efforts to do this. Can you give me a quick evaluation of the force versus the counterforce here?
Well, as you say, there are Democratic attorneys generals who are openly wargaming for this situation. And one of the reasons that they're taking this so seriously is that, at a summit like this, you have a White House official there, Kurt Olson, who's been charged by President Trump to reinvestigate the 2020 election. Kurt Olson and his investigation was what started the raid down in Georgia. So these are people who have already managed to get the federal government to take unprecedented steps. And I think that that's raising a lot of alarm among experts and Democratic officials and even some Republican officials about what they could possibly do as the midterms get closer. People are taking this very seriously, and they're trying to get ready for it.